Hi, I'm Jim Clark, a forest ecologist at Duke University. We've been studying climate effects on forests for several decades now. Structured inventories are one of the ways we obtain information on how ecosystems are changing through time. Today we're going to talk about a specific type of structured inventory, forest inventories that are tracked through time. Renata, one of the PhD students in the lab who's been studying climate effects on urban forests, she's going to take us out into the field with Rob, one of our field sites at Mountain Lake Biological Lab. It's also a NEON site, and she's going to show us how it's done.
Yeah, I thought when the sun came out it was going to get warmer.
Structured inventories, why they matter, why we care, and how we can collect the data.
This is so awesome. We're up here in the woods, right at Mountain Lake Biological Station up in Virginia. This forest is awesome. I feel like there should be elves running around.
And we're here with Renata, who's going to tell us all about structured inventory sites and why they're important. And trust me, they're really important. You're going to want to pay attention.
I really like to think about how individuals, both human and otherwise, interact with their environment, how we're shaped by it and how we shape it in return. And the cool thing about ecology is you study these communities and you study them in combination, so that you can see how this tree, for example, is interacting with the soil, with the other plants, and then how those influence the tree in return, which I always thought was really exciting and very cool. Being outside, I love it. It's amazing. It's a stress release. But what I really do like is seeing the connections on paper afterwards, pulling something out of the statistics and the numbers that you got and have a picture and a story. And that story that it paints is something about the world in which we live, which I find really compelling. And then hopefully gives us the tools to think about what things are going to look like in the future. And that to me is something that's really important as we think about planning for climate change and influences on society. How do we know enough about what's here right now to plan for what is likely to come in the future?
So our natural next question was, why do we collect data in structured inventories?
One thing is there are a lot of trees or a lot of things in the world. It's a very big place. If we're trying to understand trends across the whole country, to actually look at every place is impossible. It would take millions of, probably thousands of people and millions, if not billions of dollars. But we still want to understand what's happening, right? We want to understand what's happening now, what the trends are, what it's going to look like in the future. Are we managing things well? Or do we have disease outbreaks that are happening? Are trees dying? Are animals moving through differently? Any question you want to know about broad scale trends, you have to figure out, okay, how do I collect data on a scale that's this big when I can't do everything, when I can't sample every spot? Structured inventories are what help answer that question. You can look at a subsample, just a little bit of area across a big region, but what you get is that because they're done systematically so that you can combine them together, you can then take a very small area and extrapolate to something way bigger. So I can look at maybe 10 places in, let's say, the southeastern US, get a sense for what trees, what animals, what birds, something are in this area. And then I can use that to get a sense of what's happening across the entire southeastern US. It's not perfect, of course. It would not be perfect unless we sampled everything, but it gets you close. And that allows you to have enough information to answer some of the pressing questions that we're seeing at regional and even global scales.
And it just so happens where we are right now is an area where we can collect data just like that. We happen to be at a NEON site. So Renata walked us through what one of the plots looked like.
NEON gets really specific data, or kind of small scale data on every plant that's in some of these areas. So right by the corners in this 1 meter squared area, they'll look at literally every moss, every fern, every little thing. So if we step in it, we can mess up their results. So we want to be really careful not to mess with those plants.
Here, so you can see stakes where they're doing very intense sampling. And then these are the seed fall traps. There's a whole bunch of them all around where they're pulling the seeds out of.
So this right here is a seed fall trap, which allows us to see the seeds that have come from all the trees in the area, and we can catch them right here, collect them, and identify them later. So now we have Jordan, who's looking at canopy measurements and crop counts. That, and I will say at some sites with the binoculars, if you have mosquitoes, you get a nice ring of bug bites right around the outside. Really? The other thing we measure is DBH, or diameter at breast height, which lets us estimate the size of the tree.
Collecting data like this at the various NEON sites across the country then allow you to create a structured inventory.
So a structured inventory is you have a very set way of doing something, that allows you to look at everything that's in an area, like all the trees in a, let's say 40 by 40 meter box, for example, all of the trees in this 40 by 40 meter box, but you do it in a way that you can replicate in a different place, which means that you compare what I see right here in this area to what I see down the river, to what I see in Montana, to what I see in Florida. So what it allows you to do is have a replicable method that you can then use to compare statistically.
So I asked Renata if she could explain some trends with some of the trees that we saw here, and she had a very good example with the oaks.
And then some giant oaks, like you see that big one right up there. I think it's another red oak. So they're an important species. They also provide a lot of habitat. Right, look at that. It's pretty substantial. Now the thing about them is people anecdotally, a lot of land managers, folks who lived in an area, were noticing that it seemed like some oaks were dying in places or they were moving, but they didn't really know how much or how big of a deal it was, because there's no way to check. You see what's in your backyard. You don't know what's happening across the entire area. So this, from the Fay article in 2011, looking at the changes in oak over from 1980 to 2008, they actually looked at these 9 species here that are prevalent in the eastern US. And what this pink means right here is that you're actually seeing a decrease in relative importance. So there's less oak in comparison to, say, maple or something else. And the green means you're seeing an increase. So there's more oak relative to some other species, right? And you can see right here that these oaks all look pretty different, right? This one down here, water oak, it's doing pretty well, right? In the southern part of the southeast, it's green all over the place. Whereas you look at post oak, there's a lot of pink happening, right? Especially in this area right over here, kind of going into eastern Texas. So you're seeing this kind of intense spatial variation here that's really hard to manage unless you have this kind of data that gives you enough kind of spatial granularity to know where it's getting more important and where it's getting less important, or at least more relatively abundant and less relatively abundant.
Renata then showed me other data, where you could see trees expanding in some areas and declining in others, basically trees moving.
Why does that matter? Why do we care? Like, great, okay, trees are moving. Whoop-de-doo. There are a couple things that are powerful about it. One is we want to, let's say there are a lot of folks who live off of timberlands, right? There are lots of companies that will use it to make money, but also communities that rely on that. We're seeing trends and changes in the forests. And so there are some places where you can't grow the trees that you used to be able to grow because the climate is shifting. There are some places where disease have wiped out the trees that you might used to be able to grow. And so as these folks are figuring out, okay, where do I put my next lumber mill? Where do I decide to focus my energy to manage my forest? Even if I'm still going to manage my forest here, how do I do it to get the timber that I need, for example? They all need to know about forest trends. They need to know what's happening so they know what's likely in the future. And that's just one example, right, with a very timber-focused orientation. One like me, I'm super excited to think about what is the impact of our urban centers in an issue like the spread of oaks. Usually cities are considered people don't think about them, don't think about their forests as much, because it's a little different. But cities can be pretty important. One, you can plant oaks, for example, in a city where it's likely to grow well in the future, or where you're struggling to maintain a good oak population somewhere else, and maybe you can make sure that you at least have habitat for the species that need the oaks for right now. Or sometimes people will plant a species that isn't quite yet in a city, but they're thinking about, okay, with climate change, it might actually work better here in the future. And you'll actually do something called assisted migration, where you plant a species where it might end up in the future to kind of help it along and maybe speed the trajectory. So I think it's important to think about how cities influence these regional forests and interact with them, and pay attention to what's happening trend-wise and which species are doing well, which species are struggling, both now and in the long term as we think about what species should we plant in our urban centers. Both because people care about trees, people care about having a nice charismatic chestnut or an oak or whatever in your city, but also because that might be helpful for the other species that live with us and for long-term trends in forests.
The measurements that Renata showed us how to take, the data like this is being collected all across the country in several different structured networks. NEON, the National Ecological Observation Network, represents a relatively small number of sites where huge numbers of variables are being measured. So there's a lot of intensive sampling that goes on at each NEON site. The U.S. Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, FIA, is a contrasting sort of structured network where there are hundreds of thousands of sites, but only tree information is collected. So there are two contrasting types of forest inventories. We're using both of them in the analysis we're doing. Some of the things that we want to get to in the vignette is how to extract these data and use them to answer scientific questions. In our own lab, we've been looking at where is the suitable habitat for species moving as climate changes. So as we look forward 30 years into the future, for example, loblolly pine is going to find a lot of suitable habitat far north of where it is now. For those populations to be sustainable, they'll have to occupy those sites at least as fast as they lose suitable habitat in the south. So this is a question that we've been addressing by trying to look at the effects of climate change on both seed production and recruitment. And so some of the maps you can see here show where seed is being produced across the country. And then on the right-hand side, there's a map showing where recruitment is occurring. Analyses like these are helping us to understand how forests are coping with climate change and how they can respond to climate changes into the future. The vignette that takes us through the analysis of these data is shown below.